Good morning. Yeah, as Kelly said, I'm Chris Bishop, Board Director of UKATA. Been involved with the association since it started, and prior to that, the Asbestos Training Providers Working Group. So, with a background of more than 25 years in the industry, maybe you've come across me, irrespective. Lovely to be here, and thanks for the opportunity for today. Not only am I a board director, I've got my own independent training consultancy. Today's presentation, asbestos in the Twin Towers. I'll be honest, when we first sort of mooted the idea, we sort of planned it out without really thinking it through and looked at the diary, and September seemed quite an ideal time when everyone was back off holiday. We decided that it could be a little insensitive, so we actually pushed it on another month. And talking of sensitivity, I need to give you a bit of a warning. I've got some film footage embedded within the presentation. You may find it a little bit disturbing and upsetting. I also feel I ought to say that I'm really trying to shy away from heavy statistics involved in the session, and I'd like to acknowledge various US sources of information that I've borrowed in the compilation of this presentation. So let's make a start. Asbestos use in construction, and in particular the Twin Towers. The original World Trade Center Twin Towers were completed in the early 1970s. They were amongst the most ambitious, innovative, and influential skyscraper projects ever constructed. Standing at more than 1,368 and 1,362 feet tall, each with more than 110 stories, they transformed the skyline of New York City, but also marked a significant leap forward in architectural and structural engineering design. The towers have since gained iconic status, not just because of the tragic destruction on September the 11th, 2001, but because of how the design responded to the technical, logistical, and aesthetic demands of post-war urban development. During the construction of the Twin Towers in the late 1960s and early 1970s, asbestos was widely used due to its properties of heat resistance, and we know that there are various other applications due to it being an incredibly durable material. It was widely used. In fact, builders were spraying asbestos around as fire protection. They were using it in cement flooring, as insulation, low density board material. And if we look in particular, notably sprayed asbestos, limpet, as I'm sure quite a lot of you know, was applied to steel beams, but only on the first 40 floors and in the North Tower. At the time, asbestos was considered the ideal material for fireproofing and insulation. And to be quite honest, some of the alternatives that we have today just didn't exist. And despite growing concerns about the health risk, it was liberally applied. So much so that we think in the North Tower alone, there's somewhere between 300 and 400 tons of asbestos. Its extensive use laid the foundation for a hidden health crisis that would only start to emerge decades later, and arguably will not know the true extent for a few more decades, if ever at all. And although the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, began regulating asbestos use during the construction period, much of the material remained embedded in the towers. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey initiated asbestos abatement programs as far back as the mid-1980s, but removal proved to be complex and costly endeavour. Consequently, significant quantities of asbestos were still present in the building at the time of the September 11th attacks. As an innovative design is all down to the architect, Minoru Yamasaki, a leading figure in the 20th century architecture. He was selected in 1962 as chief architect of the World Trade Center project. His vision for the towers was deeply informed by his personal experiences and broad fascination with modernism, as well as influences from Arabic and Japanese architecture. Yamazaki intended the towers to project surprise, serenity, and a delight in the urban context, blending dignity and elegance with the monotony and scale necessity dictated by such large developments. His fear of heights also shaped the experience of inhabiting the buildings, leading to the use of narrow vertical office windows, only 18 inches wide. And these were to provide the occupants with a feeling of security and to create a veiled, shimmering surface over these vast steel frames. Yamazaki's aesthetic choices were purposely opposite to prevailing trends of architectural design of the time. He incorporated decorative elements inspired by Gothic arches, Arabic motifs, most prominently in the design of the Austin J. Tobin Plaza. This provided not only a civic presence, but a psychological retreat from the intense bustle of Manhattan's financial district. The original design aspirations were sometimes at odds with the practical requirements and what the clients were directing. The ultimate form of the towers was largely a response to the demand from the Port Authority for nearly 10 million square feet of rentable office space on a single site. Yamazaki originally proposed 80-story towers, but was compelled to increase this to 110 stories, making it possible to meet client demands while still retaining, as he described, an intimate and humane quality in the user experience. The site, selected in 1962, was a 16-acre superblock in Lower Manhattan, previously occupied by the bustling Radio Row and hundreds of low-rise buildings. The requirements to clear such a large area and maintain accessibility for subways and major arterial routes proved significant logistical challenges. The master plan envisaged 2 giant towers, flanked by a series of shorter buildings, 4 smaller buildings and a hotel, organised around a central open-air plaza, with landscaping offering a retreat from the bustle of surrounding areas. A below-ground concourse connected shopping transportation hubs of the metro, escalators, moving pavements, making the complex a self-contained city within the city. A central challenge for tall building design, especially at heights unprecedented in the early 1960s, was vertical transportation of people. In a traditional configuration, lift and elevator shafts quickly take up too much floor areas at high rise, reducing economic viability. Yamazaki innovated with the sky lobby system, essential vertical zoning. Express elevators ran directly to these sky lobbies on the 44th and the 78th floor, where occupants then transferred to local elevators. And this was mimicking the operational logic of New York City's own subway system and increased the usable floor space by as much as 15%. Not only did this create column-free office space around the core and perimeter walls, it also gave tenants breathtaking, uninterrupted vistas across the New York skyline. Now, if we look From an engineering perspective, the most fundamental engineering innovation of the Twin Towers was the adoption of the frame tube structural system. Developed with leading structural engineers of the time and using pioneering techniques, the system used the perimeter of each tower as a gigantic rigid tube constructed from a dense grid of vertical steel box columns and horizontal spandrel plates. These are non-structural features covering spaces between structural elements such as the beams and the columns, and these were tied together at every single floor level. On each tower there were 59 perimeter columns on each face, thus making a total of 236 per tower, each space just 1 metre apart. The columns were fabricated from welded steel plates, forming box sections, and these extended continuously from the bedrock foundation up to the 107th floor, with thicknesses decreasing with height. At each floor, the columns were tied together with deep steel spandrel plates, forming structural wall panels 3 stories tall and 3 columns wide. Bolted connections staggered at every 3rd floor ensured robust continuity and redundancy of unnecessary internal structures, allowing for an open office plan area. The perimeter tube was the primary system for withstanding lateral loads from wind, and by design could tolerate the loss of several columns without catastrophic failure of the building structure. Column spacing and steel thicknesses varied with calculated wind pressure and gravity loads, increasing towards the base and the corners. So think of it as a series of elongated cones. And the system contrasted sharply with traditional skyscraper designs, which used a grid of massive internal columns by moving primary support to the exterior, leaving the interiors virtually column-free for flexible floor planning and the aforesaid uninterrupted vistas. Inside each tower was a massive central core measuring approximately 87 feet by 135 feet, consisting of 47 large steel box columns and supporting nearly half the building's gravity load. These core columns were substantially larger on the long faces and were designed to taper in thickness and size as loading decreased to the top. Multiple grades of steel were used. Core columns were fabricated as giant welded boxes at lower levels and as wide flange shapes at higher levels. The core contained elevator shafts, restrooms, major mechanical electrical systems, and 3 stairwells carefully clustered for minimum interruption of the rentable space and maximum safety. The core, a structure in itself, ensured an openness but also strength, even in the instance of catastrophic damage to one part of the building. It was planned to an inch of its life. To bridge the vast space between the core and the perimeter tube, the towers employed long steel span trusses supporting lightweight composite concrete floor slabs, which performed several critical functions. First of all, they carried the office furniture, they provided heating, ventilation, air conditioning, these HVAC systems, and live loading. The floor systems also acted as a diaphragm to transfer lateral wind forces between the perimeter tube and the core and providing stable platforms for mechanical and other building systems. The foundation of the Twin Towers were equally bold and innovative. Manhattan's bedrock lay as deep as 65 to 85 feet below street level on the west side, adjacent the Hudson River. To excavate and build securely, engineers devised a bathtub method where a slurry wall, a sort of a coffer dam, was created, and the first time such technology was used on this scale in the United States. Excavated earth, more than 1.2 million cubic yards, was repurposed to extend Manhattan's shoreline westward, facilitating the eventual rise of Battery Park City. Given the unprecedented height and slenderness of the towers, resistance to wind loads was a dominant design priority. The perimeter tube acted as a giant vertical cantilever, while the interior core contributed to gravity load and secondary lateral stability. The towers were engineered to withstand hurricane-force winds. The design events incorporated wind speeds up to 140 miles an hour, and accounting for sway and occupant comfort, they included building stiffening and, critically, viscoelastic dampeners, over 10,000 per tower at the floor truss ends. So where the truss met the perimeter columns, these shock absorbers mitigated any sway, reduced vibration, and made rapid wind-induced motions almost imperceptible to users. The Twin Towers set new standards for construction logistics and industrialization in skyscraper building. Nearly all the structural elements, the perimeter columns, the spandrel plates, the floor trusses, were prefabricated off-site in huge sections, 3 stories tall, 60 feet long, for rapid hoisting and assembly. Modularization and repetition dramatically sped up construction, reduced costs, and by ensuring quality control, enhanced structural consistency. Erection using kangaroo hydraulic cranes and careful sequencing to build vertically with minimal interference allowed more than 200,000 tons of steel to be constructed in this skyscraper, this iconic setup. Lower levels required much thicker steel. High levels utilized thinner, higher strength steel to reduce overall building mass. All the pieces were color-coded, stenciled with identifying marks for assembly, ensuring proper placement in the overall structure. There were 2 types of concrete used. A lightweight concrete used for the tenant floor slabs, poured over corrugated steel decks to reduce total loading but enhance fire resistance. Normal weight concrete for the core and mechanical areas where heavier loads and greater compressive strength were required was introduced. This was structural engineering at the cutting edge of design and implementation. And after all, the towers were to be testament to ingenuity, aesthetics, engineering that would stand the test of time. To protect the steelwork, asbestos was widely used as a spray coating. We know that as a building material, steel's high strength is dramatically reduced at elevated temperatures. So fireproofing needed to be robust. Sprayed fire-resistive materials, SFRM, was introduced. Initially, an asbestos-containing mineral fibre, up to 20% chrysotile, was applied to steel beams and trusses up to around the 40th floor of the North Tower, while lower-density foam board, think of it as a type of AIB, was inserted in the web of the I-beam between the 2 horizontal flanges and around trusses. The reason it wasn't used beyond the 40th floor was quite simple. The use of asbestos was banned in 1970. New York City's own regulation and OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that US government agency that sets and enforces workplace safety and health standards, decided that increasing concerns over people's health meant it wasn't going to be used. So afterwards, mineral wool, fiberglass, gypsum-based products were used for the remainder of both towers and to replace asbestos on some of the lower floors. In critical high airflow areas, a hard coat of 80% asbestos in Portland cement was used. So I suppose we'd look on that as an art set. Gypsum wallboard and plaster were used on core columns, around shafts. Partitions were enclosed with multi-layered gypsum panels or vermiculite plaster, providing more than a 2-hour fire-resistant rating. Vermiculite plaster, remember? Asbestos contamination of vermiculite? Well, that was used on perimeter columns and on the exposed faces. The quality and coverage varied due to the complexity of its application, especially on those difficult to get to areas, trusses, cords and junctions, and the inspection standards were not actually implemented until much later in the building's lifespan, contributing to its later vulnerability. Fire resistance is central to high-rise safety. Think about what's happened in the UK in the last few years. What sparked, pardon the pun, what sparked off at Grenfell and how we're now treating high-rise buildings. At the time of design and construction, fire codes required 3-hour fire endurance for columns and 2 hours for structural floors. And that was achieved by a mixture of strategies. Not only was it sprayed onto structural steel, this, by the way, was upgraded after a 1975 fire and again after a terrorist bomb in '93, with increasing thicknesses specified for more robust protection. But there was also enclosure of vertical shafts and critical mechanical spacers with 2-inch thick gypsum boards as cladding to various structures. Sprinkler systems initially were only installed in the basements and surprisingly only retrofitted throughout the building from the late 1970s up to 2001, and certainly after the '93 bombing demonstrated the vulnerability of any unsprinklered areas. Partitioning floors and shafts with fire-rated wallboards and construction to maintain compartmentalization. There were problems, there were shortcomings in the application and installation, such as incomplete coverage, loss due to construction of maintenance, lack of adhesion, especially where rust existed at the time of initial application. And these were all documented during the inspections undertaken in the 1990s and of material after the collapse. The facades were sheathed in a brushed aluminium alloy, both as an aesthetic finish and as a corrosion-resistant, lightweight and durable outer skin. In total, over 1 million square feet of aluminium sheet was used. Window frames were set between steel perimeter columns, contributing to the pinstripe look of the towers and the shifting reflections observed from ground levels. I came across this picture while I was putting this together. I think that is stunning. It must have been seen from miles. It was absolute iconic. Unlike earlier skyscrapers built stick by stick, Twin Towers used a lot of prefabrication, as I mentioned. Perimeter wall, 3 stories high, 3 columns wide, were hoisted and bolted into place, minimizing on-site welding and fabrication. Floor truss assemblies, 60 feet long, were delivered as entire panels, accelerating construction. And from inception, the World Trade Center was envisaged not just as a collection of offices, but actually it was held up as a catalyst for revitalizing and regeneration of Lower Manhattan. Its completion and change to the urban environment in which they stood, and the controversies that they sparked, mark it as an enduring point of reference in debates about architectural ambition, public good, and the evolution of cities. Its design innovation shaped generations of skyscrapers worldwide, virtually all of them now employing aspects of the senior engineer's tube structures, modular construction, and high-performance material routines. As I mentioned, 1970 saw regulatory changes that were starting to curb the use of asbestos. Now, call me cynical, many people do. I strongly suspect that the US's appetite for litigation compensatory claims could have had something to do with it. The EPA discontinued the use of asbestos in construction materials by the end of the Twin Towers construction. And in response, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey established regulations and launched abatement programs in the mid-1980s. These efforts aimed to remove asbestos from the World Trade Center, but the process was difficult, time-consuming, and expensive. And ain't that the truth? Despite these initiatives, the towers still contained substantial amounts of asbestos when they were attacked on September 11th, 2001. The presence of asbestos in the buildings posed a significant threat, especially when disturbed or damaged, as the fibres, as we know, become airborne and can be inhaled by individuals. This latent danger remained largely unaddressed until the catastrophic events of 9/11 brought it to the forefront. If you consider the key law, all the bans, the current bans and restrictions in the states fall under the Toxic Substances Control Act, the TSCA. And this was amended back in 2016. In fact, the proponent of the bill, Frank R. Rosenberg, produced this Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act. And this gave the EPA more regulatory authority to regulate new and existing chemicals based on their health and environmental risks. Now, this law mandates the EPA to prioritise safety, eliminate outdated regulatory formulas, and ensure sufficient funding for chemical risk evaluations, ultimately protecting public health and allowing for continued chemical innovation. In 1989, the EPA issued an asbestos ban and phase-out rule, but the rule was overturned by a 1991 court ruling, so it was not as comprehensive as intended. And while the ban on many products like sprayed insulation and floor materials and various other things was invalidated, the ban on new uses of asbestos was allowed to stand, and bans under other acts like the Clean Air Act continue to apply to certain asbestos products. The rule was challenged in court by the asbestos industry and overturned, which ruled the ban was not the least burdensome alternative. In other words, keep carrying on, boys. The court's decision was invalidated most of the ban. As I say, some products, such as asbestos types of flooring materials, corrugated paper, commercial paper, specialty paper, were still banned by the rule. Other regulations under acts like the Clean Air Act, the CAA, continue to ban specific asbestos containing products even today. Because the 1989 ban was overturned, some asbestos containing products are still sold in the US today. However, the bans on new uses of asbestos and other specific products remain in place. Recent rules are further restricting asbestos use, including a recent ban on the last form of asbestos, chrysotile. Now, the last few years has seen a debate as to whether the current administration was going to overturn that final ban. However, in July 2025, the current administration dropped plans to allow continued use of chrysotile. And finally, we have an outright ban. And although it's been mostly phased out, there are still elements still being used. Last year, the agency, formed under President Biden, sought to finish this long fight for a comprehensive ban. The EPA said in a court filing that it will now defend the Biden administration ban of chrysotile asbestos. About time too. One problem as I get older, I have a tendency to assume people know historical events. The reality is that some of today's audience may not have been born at the time of 9/11, who were too young to understand the horrors of the day and the events that followed. The collapse of the Twin Towers, September 11th, 2001, released a massive dust cloud over lower Manhattan. As we say, an estimated 400 tons of pulverized asbestos and other hazardous materials went up in a cloud. Samples of dust collected and analysed by the EPA were later found to contain 50% non-fibrous construction debris, such as gypsum and respirable crystalline silica, 40% by weight glass and other fibres, RCS again, 9.2% cellulose, a known asthmagen, and 0.8% average, with some samples going as high as 3.3% asbestos. EPA samples in the first week found more than 25% of all dust samples taken and analysed above the 1% asbestos level. Estimates suggest 410,000 to 525,000 people were exposed, including up to 90,000 plus rescue and cleanup workers. The plume drifted across lower Manhattan and beyond. When I was researching material for this presentation, I kept coming across a phrase. There is no authoritative data set that breaks out World Trade Center asbestos attributable deaths by disease type. The World Trade Center Health Program explicitly notes it does not track cause of death for deceased members. So mortality by disease, and especially by specific exposure, such as asbestos, isn't published. The World Trade Center Health Registry has documented a wide range of health effects among those exposed, including respiratory diseases, gastrointestinal conditions, cancers, and psychological disorders. And as of 2025, more than 44,000 people have been diagnosed with 9/11 related cancers, with more than 63,000 having certified health conditions attributed to the collapse. The latency period for asbestos, as we talk about, the asbestos-related disease such as mesothelioma, ranges typically 10 to 60 years, meaning many cases are only now starting to emerge. First responders and residents continue to suffer from chronic conditions like asthma, rhinosinusitis, gastroesophageal reflux disease. The registry also reports a significant increase in cancer diagnosis, with 30% of certified members affected. These statistics underscore the long-term consequence of asbestos exposure. Interstitial lung diseases, ILD, in the World Trade Center Health Program include asbestosis, related scarring disorders of the lungs. So this category is, if you like, the most direct non-cancer proxy marker for asbestos effects. The official dashboard shows 2,405 certified cases amongst current members as of December 27th last year. Lung and cancer of the bronchus. We know asbestos is a risk factor for lung cancer, especially as a concomitant with smoking. And lung and bronchus cancers are among the most common World Trade Center cancer types. A recent summary of the cancer certification is listing more than 1,400 lung and bronchus cases amongst those who are registered. These register findings are published and they're available should anybody want to take this up. And certainly after this, I'll provide any references along the way that anybody's interested in. Mesothelioma remains comparatively rare, but it's expected to rise slowly. Because mesothelioma has a long latency period, I think we all talk 10 to 60 plus years, only a small number of cases have been formally described to date. The World Trade Center Environmental Health Center has published 4 cases through the mid-2023. That's 2 pleural, 2 peritoneal mesotheliomas. And various media or science digests point to the fact that these are probably the earliest cases identified, with more likely to occur as latency increases. We talk about the 9/11 responders. There's probably about 90,000 plus volunteers and workers who went to the aid of those people affected by the collapse, including firefighters, police officers, paramedics, construction workers, who helped with subsequent cleanup as well. It wasn't just about the day. And from June 2025 findings, the total members certified with cancer are 24,500 responders and nearly 24,000 survivors of the collapse. In the past 12 months, this is a rolling program, the WTC Health Program, has certified more than 9,500 cancers. 4,000 are contained in the group, the responders, and 5,500 from survivors, showing recent certifications that there's a shift towards more survivors developing cancers. There's been a suggestion, certainly I heard it quite a long time ago, that the responders were directed not to wear RPE, as it was thought it would exacerbate fear amongst them and the survivors. From what I can gather, they weren't directly told not to wear RPE, but many didn't due to factors like poor initial guidance, lack of adequate equipment, the unbearable conditions on site. And while many officials and fire department advise wearing masks and RPE, protective gear, many workers went without due without, due to communication difficulties, extreme temperatures, don't forget it was pretty hot in September, and the initial belief that the air was safe. Again, when looking at all these figures, we start talking about responders and survivors. There doesn't seem to be information or statistics readily available for nearby occupants, nearby residents, or those who were downwind of the toxic plume which spread across lower Manhattan into parts of Brooklyn, reached New Jersey, and even went into parts of Canada. Post 9/11, air conditioning systems became a problem. They were contaminated by the extremely fine toxic dust from the collapse, leading to health issues for those who were exposed. The dust, which included materials like asbestos, fiberglass, and aerosolized chemicals, and was easily spread through the HVAC systems, making indoor environments hazardous. The resulting widespread respiratory illnesses like chronic coughs, asthma, and sinusitis are a direct consequence of this contamination. There's a number of mechanisms by which they were contaminated, such as the direct contamination, they'd suck this stuff in, and then became, if you like, instruments, engines for spreading the toxic dust, widespread contamination of the indoor environment and exposing others. Bear in mind, it was warm, it was hot, air cons were running flat out. The dust was unusually aerosolized, meaning it was suspended as very minute particulates in the air. And it wasn't just particulates. It was this cocktail, a mix of chemicals, organic, inorganics, the remains of not only a building, but jet fuel and who knows what else was in there. The dust inside these buildings was then basically recontaminated as the HVAC systems were being circulated air around, and the densest, most toxic part of the cloud, although it was concentrated within a 1.5 mile radius of ground zero, the tiny particles, the airborne microscopics, became more dispersed, spread further, and settled on surfaces for months afterwards. The cloud initially engulfed highly populated areas of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, and consequently thick layers of dust were found in buildings for weeks, even as long as 6 months later. There was widespread dispersal as the plume rose nearly a mile high and drifted approximately 44 miles downwind the following day. During cleanup operations, the settled dust, which was a highly alkaline mixture of crushed concrete, gypsum, and other materials, was also readily stirred up by physical disturbance as the cleanup operation happened. Now, we got a lot of data, a lot of information on asbestos and exposures. One study that sort of springs to mind is the British Journal of Cancer, Nature. This and other sources indicate the ratio of asbestos-related lung cancer to mesothelioma. It's not a fixed value. It varies. It varies by population, by exposure type, and the variation between mesothelioma and lung cancer can vary from 0.6 to nearly as high as 2 in some cases, with 1.1, a 1-to-1 ratio, being used as a fairly reasonable estimate for the overall British population. Now, this all comes from a scientific study published in 2012 by McCormack, Julian Peto, and his colleagues, estimating the asbestos-related lung cancer burden from mesothelioma mortality. So if you sort of fix that in your head, that we've got this idea of a 1-to-1 ratio or thereabouts. Well, the paper goes on to say that all types of asbestos fibres can kill. For chrysotile, still widely consumed today around the world, asbestos-related lung cancers cannot be robustly estimated from a few mesothelioma deaths, and the latter cannot be used to infer no excess risk of lung or other cancers. What we do know about the collapse is the asbestos type was predominantly chrysotile based, but exposures were of a short, intense nature during and immediately after the disaster, rather than what we're probably used to looking at, chronic occupational doses typically associated with manufacturing maintenance activities. Consequently, the predictions, when you look at these ratios, people are starting to use figures of between 2 and 6 times the likelihood of developing lung cancers to mesothelioma. Now, again, I came across another interesting comment, and that was an American tome which says it's important to note that mesothelioma cases in the US are rare, with 2,669 cases in 2022. Well, I personally don't know that that's rare. I mean, if you compare it to the UK, 2,257 during the same period, I suppose when you look at overall population size, yeah, it will make a difference. The dust contained a mixture, toxic mixture, pulverized glass, cement, asbestos, lead in paint, soot, mercury, chromium, vanadium, and a whole host of other organics. Inhalation of the dust has been linked to numerous long-term health effects, including respiratory diseases, digestive issues like the gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, and various types of cancer. There's ongoing concerns. Health problems have continued to emerge years later, particularly as people have aged, and many health issues can take decades to develop after exposure. We know that meso typically takes between 10 and 60 years to manifest itself. There's variation and variance in reported cases that meso cases number somewhere between 4 and 24 at the moment as a result of the collapse. So there doesn't even appear to be these hard facts that we can base predictions on. Lung cancer, though, definitely starting to show sharper increases from 2010 onwards, with more than 2,200 cases showing by 2025. And a study of more than 12,000 responders clearly showed there's 3 times that lung cancer incidence rate in heavily exposed dust areas as opposed to minimally exposed responders. Overall exposure-related death now surpassed more than 7,000 in 2025, reflecting all illnesses linked to the toxic dust. And this is the problem. It's including asbestos-related conditions, but not solely attributable to asbestos. Non-melanoma skin cancers dominate overall and seem to be responder heavy. Prostate cancer is high in both groups, but again, still seems to be responder heavy. Breast cancer, female breast cancer, is survivor heavy Personally, I wonder if this is a reflection of gender-dominated occupation. Lymphoma, thyroid, bronch, and lung cancers show a fairly balanced. God, that's awful, isn't it? A fairly balance between the two groups of people. Hey, melanoma, pigment-producing cells from melanocyte tessellans are all responder heavy. People rushing in became exposed. So it's not just inhalation. We're now talking skin irritation and everything else. Predictions that I could get from these American sources led me to produce this table. And if you look, the projected scenarios, low, central, and high levels, if you like, the high being the worst case scenarios. I personally am surprised at the low numbers. These are projections. The answer is we don't know. Now, if you think about it, diagnoses and deaths over a period of time, we're going to have to look back at this from, I don't know, around about 2075. And that surely is, the time at which this curve is going to start coming down. And it'll reflect this sort of latent period. Are they realistic numbers? I don't know. Asbestos, we know, was present, and more than 25% of the samples contained up to 3% asbestos. 400 tons of asbestos thought to have remained, so that's in your plume that's gone up and come down. So there is going to be asbestos attributable burden, and you cannot avoid it. But, and this is the but, a credible mesothelioma trickle, although it started to come through, is certainly showing that lung cancer is at least three times, anything up to 6 times a greater incidence. Both the meso and the lung cancer pointing to meaningful asbestos component. The ratio comes from other studies that have been done, and when you consider those, and I go back to that 2012 study across the UK of a 1-to-1 ratio, well, these studies are starting to indicate that because of the material that was in there, the fibre mix, the total asbestos cancer deaths could be as high as 6 times that of any mesothelioma figures that we get out. There are uncertainties. We don't know whether or not they're going to affect, and these could affect the total swing up or down of these curves of death. If they move towards the high level, there's, if you like, a latency tail. We know that meso generally has a most common, a modal period of being seen 40 years after exposure. So if the poor victims are actually more susceptible than your general sort of mesothelioma victims, then we can assume that there will be a higher number of deaths. Conversely, if the exposure is actually lower than predicted and we get a lower long-term mesothelioma rate rather than the chronic occupational exposures arguably we're used to, then those totals will tend towards the lower end. The dust contained many carcinogens, many silica, metals, dioxins. We do not know what is going to happen. And if, as a result of these other toxins, diseases are seen, lung cancers are seen as a result of those, and effectively they dominate, then arguably the share of asbestos-related death could actually be lower. It goes back to a slight problem we have in the fact that the program, the World Trade Center Health Program, is reporting tens of thousands of cancer deaths, but it's not publishing cause-specific death, mortality. And that way, it arguably makes asbestos-only counting impossible without modelling. So, again, one study that I looked at gave a plausible central estimate of 300 to 3,700 deaths, dependent on mesothelioma latency, lung cancer attribution, where it comes from. And even as late as October the 13th this year, was it last week? Central projection, lifetime deaths attributable to asbestos in the region of 1,000 to 1,100, mainly lung cancer and mesothelioma, which appears incredibly low. I don't know. I do not know. It's not an actual figure. These are modelled estimates, and we're not going to know for years. And at this point, I must make out a reference to a presentation given by my esteemed UKATA colleague, Professor Roger Willey, at last year's European Asbestos Forum. I was actually presenting at the same time in another hall, so whilst I wasn't in on the presentation, I'm aware of what he was talking about. And he introduced the calculation he made on the Helsinki criteria to estimate the probability of asbestos-related diseases, and did a comparison of both the 9/11 disaster and the Gaza conflict. Well, for those of you who may not know, the Helsinki criteria set out, there are a set of diagnostic and attribution guidelines for asbestos-related diseases. They were first proposed in 1997 and updated again in 2014. They're based on a combination of occupational exposure history, pathological findings, radiological evidence, with a key benchmark being a cumulative exposure of approximately 25 fibre mil years as the level at which asbestosis or lung cancer may be considered caused by asbestos. The criteria include mineralogical threshold for asbestos fibres in lung tissue, as well as requirements for both exposure history and the presence of disease markers like interstitial fibrosis or asbestos bodies. Well, in the case of 9/11, we must consider a number of factors where this model may not actually hold true. Firstly, chrysotile fibres. Well, a lot of studies show that they do not accumulate within the lung tissue to the same extent as the amphiboles do, because there's a faster proven clearance mechanism. And therefore occupational history, fibre years of exposure, probably a better indicator of lung cancer risk than from chrysotile than simply looking at the asbestos fibre burden. Now, in the case of 9/11, it's unlikely due to the spread of the toxic plume. The overall number of cases cannot easily be estimated other than for those of the immediate responders and survivors. But it will only be an estimate. Secondly, the synergistic effects. We know the increased risk of lung cancer due to the effects of smoking, but that cocktail of toxins, the particulates, the aerosols, the vapors, the gases, they're going to have an unknown combining synergistic effect. We just do not know. I'm pretty confident that you'll all agree. All we can say is they're probably going to have a negative effect, and they're going to cause an increase in rate of cancers, reduce the observed time from exposure to mortality. But we just don't know. We're guessing. Maybe we need to come back and revisit this in another 50 years. So what about medical and legal responses to what happened? Well, in response to the health crisis coming from the collapse on 9/11, several medical and legal initiatives have been launched. The James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act was brought in to provide healthcare and financial support to affected individuals. This legislation identified more than 50 separate conditions associated with the dust cloud. This legislation allocated $2.8 billion for first responders and cleanup workers, residents exposed to the toxic dust. The World Trade Center Health Program offers annual checkup, mental health care, and treatment for certified conditions. So remember the picture of Marcy Borders, the white lady, the dust lady? Well, Miss Borders suffered from severe depression, leading to alcohol, drug addiction and abuse, followed by the collapse due to her severe depression. Eventually, some 10 years after the collapse, she succumbed to stomach cancer. Legal settlements have also played a crucial role, with over 10,000 rescue and recovery workers opting into a $713 million court settlement in 2010. Additional settlements with entities like the Port Authority have brought total awards to approximately $810 million. Despite these efforts, funding challenges persist, with periodic cuts threatening the sustainability of support programs. Advocacy continues to ensure that the affected receive the care and compensation they deserve. Ongoing research aims to better understand the long-term health impacts, with predictions that asbestos-related diseases could peak by about 2041. The outlook for the victims remains uncertain, but obviously very concerning. The health programme registry continues to monitor outcomes, with over 132,530 responders and survivors now enrolled. The latency period for the diseases means that new cases will probably be emerging decades after the initial exposures. And medical experts anticipate a significant rise in asbestos-related cancers, particularly among younger patients who were exposed at ground zero. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said there's a school adjacent to where ground zero is. Health professionals recommend regular medical evaluations, including respiratory and digestive system assessments to detect early symptoms. Mental health work and support is also crucial given the psychological toll of the disaster. Multidisciplinary treatment approaches are encouraged to address both physical and emotional needs. Veterans and other responders may qualify for additional benefits through the Veterans Association. Continued funding and research are essential to support affected populations and to develop effective interventions. So the legacy of the Twin Towers serves a stark reminder of the importance of stringent safety regulations and proactive screening and health monitoring. So as I decided I'd sort of just throw the, I don't know, I often refer to it as the graph of death. I'm pretty sure that if not all, most of you will have seen this sort of statistical representation by now. Typically, when we talk about asbestos, you will see across the x-axis the years, 10 to 60 at either end of this curve. And on the y-axis, they're going up, it's labelled up the number of deaths. Well, I sort of did a little intersect because we're nearly 25 years after the Twin Towers, and we're seeing this noticeable increase in deaths in New York, and definitely some are directly attributable to asbestos, but probably not all. And as we keep saying, sadly, we're not going to see a predicted peak for probably another, 17, 22 years or so. I don't think anybody knows at this stage. So that little intersect, when you sort of look forward in time, is just a portent of what's there, what's coming. And of course, it's not that sort of year by year figure that counts. What matters is the total number of deaths, the area under the curve. It's that lot. And, I think we know there were something like 3,500 died on the day. But finger in the air predictions, are we talking 70,000 deaths overall occurring decades after it happened? Truth is, I don't know. I don't think any of us really know. And if you consider the cocktail, the mix of crap that was in there, the synergistic effects, I think we're all just guessing. But once again, and I go back to that phrase that I picked up on when I was doing this research. There is no authoritative data set that breaks out World Trade Center asbestos attributable deaths by disease type. It does explicitly notes it does not track cause of death for deceased members, so mortality by disease, and especially by a specific exposure such as asbestos, isn't published. Well, I'm going to leave you with one last thought, and it's what a very good friend of mine quite often says. It doesn't matter what type or model of car that takes you out, the result is still the same. So, on that rather depressing note, I'm going to say thank you for coming.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Chris. I think there's a lot to reflect and take away from your presentation, so thank you so much for the details. We have gone over time a little bit, but that's okay. You got time to answer these handful of questions that we've got, Chris? I think there's 3.
I'll try.
Yeah, let's go straight to it. Let's see. So we have a question from Will Andrews. Will wants to know, do we know if, as a result of the incident, current air monitoring is inflated around the city still today?
Is it elevated? Right. Simple answer, I haven't looked at that. However, if you consider that any centre of population, any urban city where asbestos has been used may have elevated levels, and let's face it, we know that inside buildings they will be elevated compared to external background levels, and when you factor in air movement generally, you know, it blows it around. So is it elevated? I don't know.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. We've got a couple of questions from Ian. So the first one from Ian is, am I correct in thinking the government effectively increased the control limit to put rescue workers outside the limit to make a claim based on exposure to asbestos?
Again, the actual detail of the control limits, I'm unaware of. I don't. It's a very cynical thing to say that, isn't it? Especially when the amount of money that has been put into the program, what did we say it was, $2.8 billion. It could be one of those sort of apocryphal myths that's generated over the years. But certainly my research would indicate that payments to responders and people like that is being made. And I think one of the numbers I quoted was 132,000. So it's being monitored. And people who were involved have enrolled in this program. What isn't, and I don't think we're ever going to see it, is, if you like, the downwind consequences. Those who were downwind of the plume.
Okay, there's another one from Ian, Chris. So let's have a look. Of the recorded deaths, what percentage are actually being specifically investigated for a link to asbestos rather than more genetic lung cancers? Yeah, I can't speak today. Overall, Ian's feeling that I've got one of downplaying the event from the government stance.
The government, right? Well, we're talking our colleagues over the pond, aren't we? And is there a downplay overall? Is there investigation? I don't know to what degree post-mortem analysis is being undertaken. All the way through for the last hour or so, I've hit on that thing that there is no authoritative data set tracking asbestos attributable deaths. Now, whether or not a research program, and I didn't incorporate it, but I did come across a research funding program which indicated a series of research funded studies looking at various effects of asbestos in relation to other things. And in particular, the first one that struck me was an effect of male firefighters, prostate cancers, and I think they are actually going to look for the asbestos markers within those deaths. So I hope that satisfies Ian.
Excellent.
Thanks, Chris. And we've got one last question, so you'll have to bear with me because my pronunciation's not great today. Was the asbestos mostly chrysotile? Was tremolite in the vermiculite? I can't speak.
Right. Can I do it?
Yes,
was
please.
it mostly chrysotile? Was the tremolite or other contamination in the vermiculite?
Vermiculite,
Yeah, there
that's
will
it.
have been. There will have been. There will be amphibole in there. Asbestos, we know it, when Mother Nature or God or whatever created asbestos, it is not the standalone, little unique seam of homogeneous material. In fact, if you go back to Martin Saunders' presentation at the UKATA conference, there was a fantastic slide that he put up which showed that at one side the fibers were brown, and he said, and that's amosite, and at the opposite end of the same fiber it was blue, and it was chrysidolite. And that is because of the way the chemicals have migrated as a solid in solid compound during the formation of asbestos. So can we just say it's chrysotile on its own? And do you know what? It's a very, very brave person to do that. There will be contamination, of course.
Amazing. That's it, Chris. That's all the questions we've got. If any of our attendees do have any questions after this webinar, Chris, you're happy to answer the questions if we get any emails through.
Yeah, email.
Yeah. Amazing. Like I said earlier, this webinar has been recorded. I will send the email link out to all our attendees. And again, Chris, you're happy to share your presentation, which is amazing. So
Absolutely.
we'll get that sent out to attendees too. So that brings us to our end of our session today. A massive thank you, Chris. We really appreciate the time that you've taken out for us today. If our attendees keep an eye out for our next webinar, we're looking at November time, so keep an eye on our socials or websites for more details for that. Again, thank you for everyone joining, and again, a massive thank you to you, Chris. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye, and be safe.
That's it.